Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. I'm Patrick Cummings here with E.C. Sinkowski. Each week, we simplify the principles and practices of nutrition, health, and fitness that will help you perform better, feel better, and of course, live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Great. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. Happy summer to you and to everybody.
That's right.
We're going to talk about the science behind high-protein diets and kidney health today. Cool?
Yeah.
One of the more prevalent, let's call it myths or points of confusion perhaps on the interwebs, is that high protein diets are bad for our kidneys. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about protein, but as it relates to kidneys, we're going to talk about some common measurements of kidney health as well. I think we'll get to that towards the end. But let's start with maybe a little background on kidneys and their function, and then of course weave in why we're talking about protein as it relates to those things.
Yeah. Okay, so the kidneys, we've got two of them. They're located at the back of our
Some
abdomen.
of us do.
Yeah, that's true.
Do.
That's true. Some of us do. Located at the back of the abdomen, below the rib cage, and kind of either side of the spine. The kidneys have a ton of roles, from like regulating blood pressure and blood volume to producing hormones for red blood cell production to vitamin D activation. I mean, they do a ton of things, but specific to the topic today, they are responsible for filtering waste from the blood. And then that filtered waste ends up being disposed of via the urine. And they're pretty amazing at this filtering capacity. The human body has about 5 quarts of blood in terms of total blood volume. And every day, the kidneys filter about 150 quarts of blood. So that means that upwards of 30 times a day, your entire blood volume is being filtered. And then disposing on average about 2 quarts of urine. Again, all on average. Of course, there's going to be some variation here. Now, some of the waste products that they're filtering out are the breakdown of protein, which we're going to discuss, but also things like excess salt. Should you be taking all of those electrolyte salt drinks that I don't think you need, or many people don't need, as we've talked about before? So they're filtering that out and then disposing of that. But yeah, the concern with the high protein diet is that they might kind of overwork the kidneys. And so what happens here with proteins, the building blocks of proteins are these amino acids, and amino acids have the compound nitrogen in them. And when the amino acids get broken down or metabolized, this nitrogen is released, and it's released in the form of ammonia. Problem is, ammonia tends to be toxic or is toxic to our cells. So the liver quickly converts that ammonia to urea, and then it's sent to the kidneys and it's filtered out in the urine. But the main concern there is that the more and more protein you have, the more and more of this urea compound you're going to have, and is it going to be overloading the kidneys in their capacity to process that waste and then also rid it from the body?
Okay, so what does the research say about that in terms of the increase in protein? Does it actually do that? Is it something we should be concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have enough evidence that, especially the amount of protein that I think is necessary for people, that amount of protein is going to be safe and isn't harmful to the kidneys. Now, before I get into some of what the literature says, I think it's important to kind of point out some of the issues surrounding the literature and protein consumption with kidney health. The first is, are we talking about human studies? Of course, not animal studies. I don't care how close the rat genome is to the human genome. Humans aren't rats. So we're not going to take, animal research and assume it's the same for humans. Another one is, are we looking at observational studies versus the randomized control trials? We've certainly talked about that a lot before as well, but observational studies can give us a sense of maybe there is a relationship between two variables, but it's the randomized control trials that really show us if something is causal, like is the high protein causing the kidney issues? And I will say, specific to kidney health and protein, there are some observational and animal studies that suggest high protein is not good for the kidneys. A third thing that we have to be concerned about when we're looking at studies is, what population are we talking about? I think we're going to come back to this, but are we talking about a population that already has kidney disease? Because that's going to be different than looking at a study that's talking about an otherwise healthy population. And finally, something else that we want to consider is the length of the studies. I know we've talked about this before, but one of the things that people want to know is, well, what's going to happen to me in 10 or 20 years? But that's really difficult, i.e. impossible, to run randomized control trials for that long because somebody's just not signing up for that. So there are sometimes people want these guarantees that we just don't have the evidence in the science yet. Okay, so those are some of the factors that I'm considering when looking at the research. And we do have a good amount of randomized controlled trials with humans that find high protein diets do not harm kidney function. Now, this is the DeVries meta-analysis paper in the show notes, where basically high was considered my 0.7 gram per pound level or higher, and kidney health was unharmed. The problem, I would say, out of those considerations that I mentioned when we're looking at the literature is really that fourth consideration, and that most of the studies that are included in that meta-analysis aren't very long. We're talking about 8 weeks. So when you want to look at, okay, I want to eat this high protein diet forever, potentially, we don't really have the evidence for that. But in terms of kind of the other qualifications, so far, so good. Now, trying to find some evidence that is a longer study and high protein diet, there is the Antonio paper in the show notes. What they did is they took 14 men, okay, super small sample size, but 14 men, and they alternated between them taking in about 1.1 grams per pound up to 1.5 grams per pound, kind of in 2 or 4 block months at a time, which just an interesting study, but it was kind of like they would go up for a period of a couple months and come back down. Now, coming back down was still down to 1.1 grams per pound, so still quite high. But at least this went on for a year, and they found that there was no harmful effects on biomarkers, including kidney and liver function. So right now we have evidence that suggests, again, very small sample size, that 1.1 grams per pound is safe for people to consume in terms of their kidney health. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be kind of the longest that I've seen that we have in a randomized controlled trial sort of fashion. And it's just not that long. So in combination with the fact that I don't think many of us need 1.1 grams per pound or higher, I'm not sure why we would even consider being worried about anything higher than kind of the recommendations that I put out.
So those recommendations that obviously we've talked about a number of times is 0.7 grams per pound of body weight, protein every day. You talked about populations a little bit. Is there a population maybe who you wouldn't recommend that target for?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll even go up to 1 gram per pound. I do find that a lot of people are eating there kind of, I don't know, aspirationally, I guess. You know, they want to be as muscular as like a really top athlete or something like that. And so they're already eating at 1 gram per pound. When in reality, I think a lot of what is missing is the training volume or the intensity, as we've talked about before. So I just wanted to kind of circle back to that yeah, 0.7 grams per pound is really where I recommend for a lot of people. I will swing up to 1 gram per pound, but that's kind of the range for me. Now, in terms of people not even getting to that 0.7 gram per pound level, I would say anybody with kidney issues, of course, needs to listen to their doctor. So this could be kidney problems like chronic kidney disease, but even other comorbidities like diabetes, these populations will often not be at the 0.7 grams per pound level. There's some interesting stuff out there once people have chronic kidney disease that the amount of protein intake that's recommended changes, but I don't even want to go into more specifics than that because, again, this podcast can't really give any directions in terms of health conditions, and people need to be working closely with their doctor in their specific context. So kidney issues, other health issues, listen to your doctor for protein intake. The second population would be a population that is more sedentary. You know, coming out of the CrossFit space and working with a lot of functional fitness athletes who are interested in performance and interested in having a more muscular aesthetic, you know, that 0.7 gram per pound is going to be great. Even for clients that really want some weight loss, the 0.7 gram per pound can help with satiety. But there are going to be people who don't have those goals, that are just more sedentary. They're happy with the amount of muscle mass they have. They're not necessarily needing any satiety. There is no need for them to eat at the 0.7 gram per pound level either. I wouldn't go as low as the RDA, which is closer to 0.4 grams per pound. I'd probably be closer to the 0.55 grams per pound because that's where we have research regarding preserving muscle mass as we age. But I do think the 0.7 gram per pound is more than what people need, especially if they're not kind of in the functional fitness community and have any of those goals associated with increasing muscle mass and strength performance.
Got it. You mentioned a little bit there, folks with, let's call them kidney problems. Is that one of those things that you really only know if it's the case after you talk to the doctor? Or is there any way to say, like, I've got kidney problems, here's how I know, and now I can make some adjustments based on that?
Yeah, certainly the early stages are going to be uncovered with some of our lab tests. There are going to be some symptoms with chronic kidney disease as it advances, but early stage detection is going to be with our lab tests. And thankfully, one of the standard panels that you get with kind of your routine physical is going to do that just with a renal panel. And this will measure the amount of kind of various waste products, and it's also going to measure the filtration rate of the kidneys. This is kind of the gold standard marker. It's the estimated glomerular filtration rate or the eGFR, and it estimates how much blood the kidneys are filtering each minute, where over 90 is considered normal. And then as it decreases, that's a problem. Like 60 to 89 is mildly decreased, but tends to be more normal in an older population. Then once we get below 60, it's potentially indicating chronic kidney disease, especially if that's for a longer period of time. Now, this eGFR number is calculated based on serum creatinine, as well as your age and your sex. Now, we haven't talked about creatinine yet, and we will. And I know a lot of people have questions about it because I've gotten a bunch of questions about it. But before I do, I really want to give a disclaimer here, because I'm going to give some reasons why your eGFR may be low, or other markers like creatinine on this renal panel may be high. And I think you should still talk to your doctor about it. In fact, I had a client years ago with this exact issue. They had high creatinine and they read online that it might not be a problem. And I thankfully told them I think they should talk to their doctor regardless. Now, in combination with some other stuff they had going on, that high creatinine test led to more testing and they ended up needing surgery. So I just wanted to point that out because I feel like there's a lot of this self-diagnosing on the internet. And while I love our podcast and really do hope that it helps people kind of understand issues and different contributing factors, it certainly is not a substitute for a doctor. I mean, I'm not a doctor alone, but a 20-minute podcast could not come to describe all of the different factors and conditions specific to you. So if you have markers outside the normal range, I think you should still talk to your doctor, and maybe this podcast gives you ideas to talk to them about, but I just want to be very clear that I'm not sort of saying, oh, you should ignore a high marker. Again, talk to your doctor. Okay, now let's get into why some of these lab markers could be high. The eGFR, again, is calculated on the serum creatinine, age, and sex. Creatinine is not creatine. Creatinine is a waste product that they measure in your blood or urine, and it's basically when creatine is broken down. So creatine, the supplement that we talk about all the time, but it's also naturally in foods like meat and fish, is stored in the muscle, and creatine helps create energy in those high intensity scenarios. And after it is used for that, a waste product of that process is creatinine. So if you are supplementing with creatine, or if you have a diet that's high in meat and fish, then this can raise your creatinine levels. Similarly, if you have a good amount of muscle mass, because you're going to store more creatine and you're going to be breaking it down more often, you also can have high creatinine levels that are going to show up in your urine or blood. And then these higher creatinine levels could also then result in a low eGFR rating, such that your kidneys might appear to be having a problem or not filtering correctly, when in reality you could be otherwise fine and healthy. I should mention that this is not the entire list of things that can affect your kidney lab values. Things like over-the-counter medications, especially things like Advil, and even being, let's say, slightly dehydrated, could increase your creatinine levels. And hat tip to one of my Masterclass students, a nephrologist, Danielle, for chiming in regarding this. But over-the-counter medications and dehydration are not good for your kidneys. So those are also going to be some considerations. And when I talk about dehydration, again, it's just drinking to thirst and maintaining a pale yellow urine. It's not necessarily overhydrating all of the time. But these are some of the factors why you could have a high reading there. But nevertheless, again, still should talk to your doctor about those potential contributing factors instead of saying, oh, well, I think I'm fine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so obviously, as you mentioned a few times, talk to your doctor. But are there other considerations for an individual on a high protein diet, or individuals with lots of muscle mass, if you do all that and then if their kidney markers are still off?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that I think you can kind of bring up with a doctor could be something like, hey, I supplement with creatine, and hey, I end up, I don't know, some people are going to be taking in 1 gram per pound of body weight protein. So, hey, I have a high protein diet. One of the things that you could do is back off of those temporarily, and then you get retested. And obviously, if the numbers fall back in line into normal, then we know that your kidneys are fine. Because if they are not filtering correctly, then we would expect those readings to still be high for the creatinine or the eGFR to be low. And so obviously, if they come back into normal, it's more a reflection of your diet and maybe your muscle mass. And then again, I would also talk to the doctor about maybe hydration status or medication, because again, the going off of those for a period of time or being slightly more hydrated for the test can help bring your numbers back into line. Honestly, this is probably what the doctor is going to do anyway. When they see the numbers out of line, they're going to want to understand more why that could be the case, and they're going to want to retest. So that should be sort of the standard protocol. But I think there's something interesting there about you also altering your diet or taking away some supplementation to see what happens to the markers and to potentially, again, suggest that to them. There is also another lab marker called cystatin C. It's kind of a better metric than eGFR for measuring your filtration of the kidneys because it's not affected by diet, muscle mass, age, or gender as much. And basically, it's just a small protein that's produced constantly by many cells in the body. And typically, it has very stable levels in the blood because it's kind of produced constantly, but then the kidneys are filtering it out. So the levels should be kind of stable. But if the kidneys aren't working well, then we would expect cystatin C to rise. Now, you might be asking, well, why don't we use that as a measurement instead? Is because it's not as affected by these other variables such as muscle mass and diet. And there is definitely a push to kind of use that as more of the standard biomarker, but it's not at this time. So it might be one of those things that, hey, ask your doctor, can we get the cystatin C measured? As far as I understand, it's a bit more expensive too. So I have a feeling that they would say yes if you suggest it, but it definitely is not the standard metric right now. And then I would also suggest to consider, no surprise, lowering your protein intake. Now, again, the evidence that we have does suggest that, this 0.7 grams per pound and the 1 gram per pound is safe. But I just like to remind people that the 1 gram per pound is already clearly overshooting your needs because the protein is really going to be used for your lean tissue or your lean mass. And your lean mass isn't just your muscle mass, it's also, your skin, hair, organs, bone, etc. But nobody is 100% lean mass. I know you might want to be, Patrick, but you're not 100% lean mass. So even somebody who's very lean, they still have fat tissue. So 1 gram per pound assumes that your entire body is lean mass. You're already overshooting that. Now, do I think there's some truly professional athletes out there who can be over 1 gram per pound because they're chasing that goal, or maybe they're theoretically optimizing muscle mass gains? Sure. Or maybe they're at a high level of protein intake because their caloric intake is so high, and just by the time they reach all their calories, they're at that level of protein. Sure. Of course. But they're probably not listening to this podcast. I think that 0.7 grams per pound is plenty for so many people that we don't need to come to these really high levels, especially when we don't have evidence truly in the long term to show that kidney health is fine. And again, I just want to come back to, we did that podcast somewhat recently on the comfort crisis that, our ancestors clearly weren't eating at 1 gram per pound of body weight, and yet they were stronger upper body wise than our Olympic rowers when they were looking at some female populations. And I think it just kind of speaks to the fact that generally, culturally, as a society, we're so fixated on the eating aspect, when in reality, I think if we kind of shift some of that focus more to the intensity, training volume, and let's say even say something like sleep, we're going to overall get a better performance outcome than just kind of really staying on this high protein intake.
Got it. You said something earlier that I think is kind of interesting. Is you said eating aspirationally, right? This idea of, well, I want to be a fill in the blank, high performance athlete, whatever. So I'm going to eat as though I am now. Mm-hmm. I just think that's interesting. Can we maybe use that as a bridge to just talk about what else you see as the concerns for a high protein diet outside of kidney function, as we just walked through, but anything else that we should know or consider before maybe we fall into that trap of eating aspirationally?
Yeah. I think there's a couple concerns, but, eating aspirationally, I think it's an interesting concept because I get it. Like, if you want to be a top athlete, one of the things that they have is a different diet. And so you're thinking, okay, well, that's how I want to fuel it. I think we just have to catch ourselves a little bit and make sure that that's really our limiting factor. Is it really the fact that I'm not eating enough protein that prevents me from being Tia Claire Toomey? No, there's going to be some other things in line before I need to really worry about that. And so that's where I just like to caution people about the eating aspirationally. It's not that, a high protein might not happen once you get to that level, but is that really the limiting factor? In many cases, the answer is going to be no. But so what are some of my concerns when we really go for this high protein diet outside of this filtration stuff that we discussed? Primarily, one is that as a macronutrient increases, there's going to be less space for other foods. So as protein increases in the diet, typically carbs and or fat is going to come down. And so being overzealous on protein tends to come at the expense of other foods in the diet. And in my experience, it tends to come at the expense of fruits and veggies. I've worked with many clients who, they're eating some fruits and veggies. They've heard about this 800-gram challenge thing. But they're actually not at the 800-gram level, partially because they're not tracking it. They typically are tracking macros. And they're hitting this 1 gram per pound. And in my opinion, there's far more benefits and health risk reductions that come from kind of, let's say, over-indexing on plant matter, getting for that 800G plus, than there is over-indexing on higher protein. Like the fruits and veggies, they give us all these micronutrients. They give us this fiber, the phytochemicals, which we're still learning about. They give us satiety. It's literally impossible to find an outcome where health isn't improved with more plant matter in the diet. And so to decrease that at the expense of fitting more protein into the diet, especially at a level that the literature doesn't support you need from a performance and muscle mass standpoint, it just seems misguided at best. And then also the second kind of secondary concern to that is, what are the sources of that extra protein? Now, I want to be clear, I'm not against red meat. I'm not against saturated fat. I had some yesterday of both. But if anything, these are the two areas where we do have consistent evidence that high doses of red meat increase the risk of colon cancer, and high amounts of saturated fat can increase LDL cholesterol, which can increase heart disease risk. Again, I'm not suggesting to eliminate either, but when you start to look at how the heck am I going to get to this 1 gram per pound, or if people are really shooting for the 1 gram per pound plus, how the heck am I going to do that? We might start filling it up with more and more red meat or processed meats to get there. And we might be leaning more into some of the full fat dairy to get there, which is going to be high in saturated fat, or even some of the processed products like protein bars, which can be high in saturated fat. So kidney measurements aside, I think these are the other downsides to a high protein diet. You're missing out on fiber and phytochemicals and vitamins and minerals from plant matter. And you also might be over-indexing on kind of saturated fat or red meat components that can increase our health risk.
All right. I think that's a good place to wrap up this conversation about high protein and kidney function. Thank you, EC, as always. Thanks, everybody out there, for listening. Do make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you are listening or watching this so you don't miss another episode. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.